The first time I realized my daughter-in-law wanted my life, not just my husband's money, was the day she smiled at me during his funeral. The church smelled like lilies and candle wax, the kind of heavy sweetness that settles into your clothes long after you leave. I sat in the front pew of St. Andrew's beside my son Daniel, while people whispered condolences I could barely hear anymore. After 43 years of marriage, my husband Richard Carter was gone, and somehow I felt less like a widow than a stranger attending someone else's tragedy. Vanessa stood near the altar in a fitted black dress that looked too elegant for mourning, greeting guests with soft tears and careful smiles. Everyone kept telling me how strong she was, how devoted she had been during Richard's final months. I nodded every time because that was easier than explaining the strange ache sitting in my chest every time I looked at her. Then I noticed the necklace. My diamond sapphire pendant. Richard gave it to me on our 25th anniversary during a trip to Charleston. I hadn't seen it in months. I assumed it was locked away somewhere in my bedroom drawer upstairs. Yet there it was resting against Vanessa's throat while she touched people's arms and thanked them for coming. For one brief second our eyes met across the church, and instead of looking embarrassed, she smiled. Not warmly, not apologetically, possessively. "Beautiful service, Evelyn," she whispered later as she sat beside me during the luncheon downstairs. Richard would have wanted everything to stay peaceful today. Something about the way she said everything made my stomach tighten. Around us, relatives carried paper plates filled with baked ham and potato casserole, while old family friends shared stories about Richard's business success and charity work. Daniel stayed unusually quiet beside the coffee station, staring at his phone more than once like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. I tried convincing myself grief was making me paranoid. Vanessa had been part of this family for nearly 12 years. I helped plan her wedding. I babysat her children. I defended her every time Daniel complained she spent too much money. But over the past year, little things began replaying in my head differently. The private conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The way Richard suddenly cared about his appearance again at 71 years old. The unexplained business trips. The locked office door. "You should get some rest after tomorrow," Vanessa said casually while stirring cream into her coffee. "Tomorrow?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly. "The will reading." I froze. Richard's attorney had scheduled the reading only the night before. Daniel himself told me he hadn't informed anyone yet, because he wanted immediate family only. Yet Vanessa spoke about it like she already knew every detail. Before I could ask another question, my sister-in-law Gloria approached our table and squeezed my shoulder. "You holding up okay, Evie?" she asked gently. I forced a smile. "Trying to." Vanessa stood and smoothed her dress. "Richard wanted all of us taken care of," she said softly enough for only me to hear. Then she leaned closer, her perfume sharp and expensive. "Some of us more than others." She walked away before I could respond. Across the room, I watched her slip her hand through Daniel's arm while guests admired what a graceful widow's daughter-in-law she seemed to be. And for the first time in my life, sitting there beneath fluorescent church lights with cold coffee trembling in my hands, I felt something far worse than grief. I felt replaced. The rain started just as I pulled into the parking garage beneath Whitmore and Dale Legal Associates the next morning. Thin gray sheets blurred the windshield while I sat gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, staring at my reflection in the glass. I looked exhausted, older somehow, like the last 48 hours had aged me more than the previous 10 years combined. Richard used to joke that rainy mornings in Boston made everyone look guilty. The memory almost made me smile until I remembered Vanessa already knew about the will before anyone was supposed to. By the time I reached the conference room upstairs, everyone else had already arrived. Daniel stood near the windows with his hands buried in his coat pockets while Vanessa sat comfortably at the long mahogany table beside Richard's attorney, Gregory Hale. Comfortable was the only word for it. She did not look nervous or emotional. She looked prepared. "Evelyn," Gregory said gently as I entered, "please sit wherever you would like. Wherever I would like." Strange thing to say inside the office where my husband's entire life was about to be divided into paperwork. I chose the chair furthest from Vanessa. She gave me another one of those practiced sympathetic smiles that never reached her eyes. The room smelled faintly like leather and coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Gregory adjusted his glasses, and opened the thick estate folder in front of him. Richard Carter updated his will approximately 7 months ago, he began carefully. 7 months. Around the same time Richard suddenly became protective over his phone. Around the same time he stopped asking me to accompany him to charity events. I folded my hands tightly in my lap and listened. At first the details sounded ordinary enough. Donations to St. Andrew's Church. Contributions to a medical foundation. A scholarship fund in Richard's father's name. Then Gregory cleared his throat. The Carter residence, including all furnishings and attached property holdings, transfers solely to Vanessa Carter. My chest tightened instantly. I blinked once, convinced I had misunderstood him. But Gregory continued reading. The investment accounts. The lake house in Maine. Richard's antique car collection. Majority ownership shares in Carter Supply Group. Nearly everything passed directly to Vanessa. Not Daniel. Not the grandchildren. Vanessa. The only thing left to me was a modest monthly allowance from a trust fund Richard established years earlier. It was enough to survive on comfortably, but that was not the point. 43 years of marriage reduced to a scheduled deposit. Silence swallowed the room after Gregory finished speaking. I stared down at the polished table, unable to process what had just happened. Richard built that company beside me. I worked the front desk when we could not afford employees. I packed orders in our garage during snowstorms. While Daniel slept in a playpen beside stacks of invoices. I stood beside Richard through every mortgage payment, every business failure, every recovery. And now legally I owned almost nothing. Mom, Daniel finally said quietly. I looked up at him, desperate for some sign of outrage, confusion, anything. But he only looked tired. Vanessa reached across the table and rested her hand over his. Richard trusted me to protect what he built, she said softly. Protect. The word landed like an insult. Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even he seemed uneasy now. There are additional instructions, he said carefully. Mrs. Carter may continue residing at the family home for 30 days before transition of ownership is finalized. 30 days. Vanessa lowered her eyes as though pretending embarrassment. I know this is emotional, she murmured. But Richard was very clear about wanting stability. Stability. I almost laughed at the cruelty hidden inside that word. Across the table, Daniel avoided looking directly at me again. And suddenly I realized something even more painful than losing the house. My son already knew. When I returned to the house that evening, it no longer felt like the place I had lived for more than 3 decades. The key still worked in the front door, but the sound it made when it turned felt unfamiliar, almost like I was unlocking someone else's life. Inside, the air smelled different, sharper, like expensive candles had replaced the old warmth of familiar rooms. The living room had already changed. The family photographs that once lined the fireplace were gone, replaced by minimalist framed artwork I did not recognize. Even the sofa cushions had been replaced with neutral tones that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby, rather than a home filled with memories. I stood there for a moment holding my coat, unsure where to place it because the coat rack had been removed entirely. Vanessa appeared from the hallway wearing a soft cream sweater and perfectly styled hair, as if she had been expecting me. "Oh, Evelyn," she said gently, tilting her head with that same rehearsed concern I had started to recognize. I was not sure what time you would be back. I looked past her into the hallway and saw boxes stacked neatly along the wall. My boxes. Some were labeled in my handwriting. Others were already sealed with tape. What is all of this? I asked quietly. Vanessa followed my gaze and smiled faintly. Just helping you prepare for the transition. 30 days goes by quickly, and I thought it would be less stressful to organize things early. Less stressful. The words felt misplaced in my chest. Before I could respond, Daniel walked in from the kitchen holding a glass of water. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as he leaned against the counter. "Mom, it is probably easier this way," he said carefully. Easier. That word again. I had spent my entire life raising him, and now he spoke to me like I was a temporary guest who needed convenience. Easier for whom? I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. Vanessa stepped forward and lightly touched one of the boxes. Richard wanted everything handled efficiently, she said. There is no need to make this more emotional than it has to be. Emotional. I almost laughed at the irony. I had not raised a family built on efficiency. I had raised one built on shared dinners, late-night conversations, scraped knees, and years of sacrifice that never once felt transactional to me. I walked slowly toward the staircase, noticing that even the hallway lighting had been replaced. The soft yellow glow I remembered had been exchanged for bright white LEDs that made everything feel colder. Upstairs, my bedroom door was slightly open. When I stepped inside, I stopped completely. The room had been partially cleared. My dresser drawers were open and half empty. My clothing had been sorted into piles on the bed. Some things were gone entirely. My jewelry box was missing. I turned back toward the hallway just as Vanessa appeared behind me. "I thought it would be helpful to start sorting personal items," she said softly. "Some of these things can be donated if you do not want them." Donated. The word echoed in my mind. I looked at her carefully for the first time that night. There was no hesitation in her expression, no guilt, only quiet certainty, as if everything happening here had already been approved long before I entered the room. "Where is Richard's study key?" I asked suddenly. Vanessa paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "It is being reorganized as well. Daniel thought it would be best to secure certain documents." Daniel shifted behind her but did not correct her. That silence told me more than anything else. I turned away and walked back downstairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. The house I built my life inside no longer welcomed me. And for the first time since the will reading, I understood something deeply unsettling. This was not just about inheritance. This was about erasing me while I was still alive. That night I could not sleep in the house that no longer felt like mine, so I sat in the dim light of the guest room Vanessa had assigned to me as if I were temporary staff rather than the woman who had lived there for decades. Around 2 in the morning I found myself standing in the hallway again, listening to the silence of a home that used to be filled with familiar sounds, footsteps, laughter, the small noises of a shared life. Now there was only quiet control, as if every room had been carefully edited. I walked slowly toward the study door downstairs, the one place Vanessa had told me was being reorganized. The door was locked, but the lock was old, and I still remembered where Richard used to hide a spare key. After a few minutes of searching, I found it taped beneath a wooden shelf inside the pantry, exactly where he used to keep emergency items during storms. My hand shook slightly as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The study smelled like aged paper and faint cologne, as if Richard had only just left. But something was wrong. The desk drawers had been partially emptied, and several files were missing. I moved carefully through the room, opening cabinets, scanning shelves, until I noticed a small metal box pushed far behind a row of legal binders. It was not something I recognized. Inside the box were envelopes, some sealed, some opened and carefully resealed. My name was not on any of them. Instead, I saw Vanessa's name repeated in different handwriting, different dates. I sat down slowly, my heart tightening as I opened the first envelope. Inside were printed bank statements tied to accounts I had never seen before, all connected to Richard's business holdings, all with transfers directed toward Vanessa over several years. The second envelope contained hotel receipts from different cities, all dated when Richard had claimed to be traveling for work. The third contained printed email exchanges, short and carefully written, but unmistakably personal in tone. I felt my breath become uneven as I read line after line, each one confirming what I was not supposed to know. This was not recent. This had been happening for years. I closed the box for a moment and pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady myself, but then I noticed something else on the desk. A photograph, slightly faded, showing Richard and Vanessa sitting together at a restaurant I did not recognize. The date on the back was nearly 8 years old. I stared at it longer than I intended, my mind struggling to connect the version of my husband I had known with the man in that image. A sound from outside the room made me freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. I quickly placed everything back into the box and returned it to its original position just as the door handle turned. I stepped back into the shadows of the room while Daniel appeared in the doorway. He looked surprised to see me there. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly what I was doing awake. I hesitated, then simply said I could not sleep. He nodded but did not come closer. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the desk, then back to me, as if he suspected something but was afraid to ask. "Mom," he said finally, his voice lower than before. "Just try not to dig into things that will only hurt you." There was something in the way he said it that made my stomach tighten again. It was not concern. It was warning. He left the room without another word, and I stood there alone once more, realizing that the truth was not hidden far away anymore. It was already inside the house, inside the people I trusted most, and I was beginning to understand that I had never been meant to find it. At all. After what I found in the study that night, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was just a misunderstanding. The next morning, I told Daniel I was going out for errands, but instead I drove 20 minutes outside the city to a small bank branch Richard used for personal accounts before his business expanded. I remembered the place because he once said it was the only bank where people still knew your name instead of your account number. The building looked almost unchanged, a modest brick structure with a faded sign and a quiet parking lot. Inside, the air smelled like paper and old coffee, and I approached the counter with a calm I did not feel. I asked to review any accounts associated with Richard Carter under my name as his spouse. The bank employee, a middle-aged man with careful eyes, hesitated before checking the system. After a few moments, his expression shifted slightly, not surprised but cautious. He told me there were accounts linked to Richard that had been modified several years ago, but access was restricted. When I pressed gently, explaining I had been present for every part of my husband's life and business, he lowered his voice and said something that made my stomach tighten. There were authorized secondary beneficiaries added without my knowledge. The primary name listed was Vanessa Carter. I sat there in silence for a moment, watching the cursor blink on his screen as if confirming what I already suspected but did not want to fully accept. Before leaving, I asked one more question, whether there were any large transactions in recent years that stood out. He hesitated again, then mentioned consistent transfers to a series of private accounts tied to travel expenses and property maintenance, none of which matched the lifestyle I had known. By the time I left the bank, my hands felt cold even though the day outside was warm. I drove home slowly, passing streets I had traveled for years but suddenly felt unfamiliar. When I arrived, I found Vanessa in the kitchen arranging fresh flowers in a glass vase as if nothing in the world had shifted. She looked up and smiled politely, asking if my errands had gone well. I told her. They were fine, and she nodded as if that answer satisfied her. Later that afternoon, while she was out for lunch with Daniel, I went to speak with Miguel, the man who had maintained Richard's garden for over a decade. He still came twice a week, tending the hedges and roses Richard insisted on keeping even when maintenance became expensive. Miguel greeted me with quiet respect, but when I asked him about any changes he had noticed over the years, he became visibly uncomfortable. After a long pause, he mentioned that there were nights when Richard was not alone in the house when I was traveling to visit my sister. He said he had seen Vanessa arrive through the side gate more than once late in the evening, always when Daniel was away for work trips. He avoided my eyes as he spoke, as if he regretted remembering. I thanked him and asked him not to repeat it to anyone. That evening, I returned to the house and stood in the hallway longer than usual, listening to the silence again, but this time it felt different. It no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by things I had never been allowed to see. I realized then that the story I had lived for decades was not being rewritten in front of me. It had already been rewritten long before I was ever given the chance to read it. Over the next 2 days, the house became even more unfamiliar, not because of major changes, but because of small deliberate ones that made me feel like every corner of my life was being quietly rewritten. Vanessa moved through rooms with the ease of someone who believed ownership had already been fully transferred, speaking on the phone in low confident tones about contractors, financial advisors, and upcoming decisions for the property as if my presence was no longer relevant to any of it. Daniel remained distant, caught between politeness and avoidance, never staying in one room with me for too long. I began spending more time alone in the older parts of the house, especially the storage room near the back staircase where things that had not been touched in years were still kept. That was where I found the first sign that something deeper had been hidden for a long time. It was an old cardboard box labeled as holiday decorations, but inside it was not what I expected. There were outdated electronic devices, a few discarded photo albums, and a small handheld camcorder that looked like it had not been used in years. I sat on the floor and turned it over in my hands, noticing a label taped to the side with Richard's handwriting, marked simply as archive. My fingers hesitated before I pressed the power button. The battery was surprisingly still functional, and after a few seconds of static, the screen flickered to life. What appeared first looked like ordinary home recordings, family gatherings, dinners, holidays, moments I vaguely remembered from years ago. But as I continued scrolling through the stored files, I noticed gaps in time that did not match anything I could recall. Certain dates were missing entirely, replaced with recordings that had no clear context at first. Then I found a file dated nearly 6 years earlier. I pressed play. The footage showed the living room at night, dimly lit, with Richard sitting on the sofa speaking quietly to someone off camera. Vanessa entered the frame a moment later, her behavior different from anything I had seen in recent days. There was no performance, no carefully controlled expression. It was direct, familiar, and private. They spoke in low voices about travel schedules, financial arrangements, and changes to documents I did not fully understand at the time. I felt my breath slow as I realized these were not casual conversations. These were coordinated discussions about decisions that affected the entire household. I stopped the video and sat back for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I found another recording. This one was more recent, dated just before Richard's health declined significantly. In it, Vanessa was alone in the room going through documents on the same desk I had used for decades. She was not rushing. She was organized, deliberate, taking photographs of papers and placing them back exactly where she found them. A moment later Richard entered, and instead of reacting with confusion or anger, he spoke to her calmly, almost routinely, as if this was an established pattern rather than a violation of privacy. I felt a cold stillness settle in my chest. I turned off the device and stared at it for a long time before realizing something important. These recordings were not hidden by accident. They were stored carefully, preserved intentionally, as if someone had expected them to be found eventually. That realization changed everything I thought I understood about secrecy in this house. That night, I returned the camcorder to its box but did not put it away. Instead, I carried it with me upstairs and placed it inside my room. For the first time since the will reading, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was beginning to understand that everything I had been seeing was only the surface of a much older design, one that had been quietly unfolding long before I ever noticed the cracks. After spending that night staring at the camcorder stored beside my bed, I did not sleep. Instead, I replayed everything I had seen in my mind until the details stopped feeling like fragments and started forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. By morning, I understood something I had been avoiding for too long. Nothing in this situation was random. Every change in the house, every missing document, every calm explanation from Vanessa, and every quiet avoidance from Daniel had been carefully positioned long before I ever questioned it. I made coffee that morning without tasting it and sat at the kitchen table after Vanessa left for what she called a meeting with an interior consultant. Daniel had already gone to work, leaving behind the same distant silence he had been carrying for days. I opened my notebook, the same one I used for grocery lists and appointments for years, and for the first time wrote something that had nothing to do with routine life. I began listing everything I knew for certain. The bank accounts, the altered will, the recordings, the travel records, the private transactions, and the timeline of events that no longer made sense when placed together. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that I was not dealing with confusion or misunderstanding. I was dealing with coordination. By late morning, I contacted a legal advisor I had not spoken to in years, a woman named Margaret Hill who had once helped Richard with a property dispute. When I explained only part of what I had discovered, she asked me to come in immediately. I did not bring emotion with me into that office, only facts. I placed copies of what I had found on her desk and watched her expression shift from polite attention to focused concern. She did not interrupt me once while I explained the changes to the estate, the timing of the will revision, and the financial movements tied to Vanessa. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and told me something I did not expect. She said that based on the structure of the documents, there were elements that suggested influence over decision-making during Richard's final years. Not a legal proof on its own, but enough irregularity to warrant a deeper investigation if additional evidence existed. She advised me to stop confronting anyone directly, and instead focus on documentation. Everything needed to be preserved, organized, and verified before any formal action could be taken. I left her office feeling something I had not felt in days. Not anger, not confusion, but direction. Over the next several days, I moved differently inside the house. I did not argue. I did not question Vanessa. I did not react to subtle comments or changes in the environment. Instead, I observed. I copied files quietly when I could access shared devices. I documented conversations I overheard. I noted inconsistencies in schedules and statements. Each night I added to a private folder stored on a secure drive I purchased without informing anyone. At the same time, I began preparing something else. A dinner. I told Daniel and Vanessa that I wanted to bring the family together properly, to honor Richard's memory in a more meaningful way than rushed conversations and divided emotions. Vanessa accepted immediately, even suggesting guest arrangements and menu details as if the event already belonged to her vision. Daniel agreed without hesitation, relieved perhaps that I was no longer resisting openly. What neither of them knew was that I was not planning reconciliation. I was organizing clarity. Chose the date carefully, giving enough time for all relatives who had attended the funeral to be available. I made sure the house would be full. I confirmed seating, lighting, and even the position of the screen in the living room. I spoke calmly every time someone asked me about my intentions, and I allowed them to believe what they wanted. On the surface, I was the grieving widow trying to hold a family together. But beneath that surface, I was assembling the final structure of something they had not yet realized was already in motion. And for the first time since Richard's death, I was no longer waiting to understand the truth. I was preparing to show it. The evening of the gathering arrived with a quiet tension that I carefully kept hidden behind calm movements and polite expressions. The house had been prepared exactly as I had planned. The dining table set with simple white linen, soft lighting adjusted to create a warm atmosphere that would make everything feel natural and unthreatening. Guests began arriving shortly after 6 in the evening, familiar relatives from both sides of the family, old friends of Richard, and a few neighbors who had known us for decades. Their conversations filled the rooms with soft noise, laughter mixed with polite condolences, the kind of atmosphere that usually signals comfort and unity. Vanessa moved among them with effortless confidence, greeting everyone as if she had always been the center of this family's structure. She wore a calm expression that suggested control, occasionally glancing toward me as if checking whether I was still maintaining the role she expected from me. Daniel stayed closer to the kitchen, speaking quietly with relatives but avoiding long conversations. I observed everything without interruption, noting how easily the room adapted to Vanessa's presence, as if the last several decades of history could be quietly overwritten by confidence alone. When dinner concluded, I stood up slowly and asked everyone to move into the living room for a moment longer. I explained gently that I had prepared something to share in memory of Richard, something I believed would bring clarity and closure to everyone present. The request was met with mild curiosity rather than concern. Vanessa smiled faintly, as if expecting a sentimental speech or family slideshow. Daniel looked uncertain but did not object. I waited until everyone was seated before dimming the main lights slightly and adjusting the screen I had placed earlier in the room. For a brief moment, the house became completely still. Even the usual background sounds seemed to disappear. I looked around at every face in the room and realized how many of them had once trusted this family completely, how many of them had believed in the version of us that had been carefully presented over the years. Then I pressed play. The first image that appeared on the screen was the interior of this very house from years earlier, captured from the camcorder I had found. A few guests leaned forward slightly, confused but still patient. Then Richard appeared in the footage, speaking in a tone that was calm but deliberate, followed shortly by Vanessa entering the frame. The room shifted instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were set down without sound. The atmosphere that had been warm only minutes earlier became rigid with attention. As the recording continued, details emerged that no one had expected to see in a setting like this. Conversations about financial decisions, private arrangements, and modifications to legal documents played clearly through the speakers. The expressions in the room changed one by one as understanding began to form. Vanessa's composure was the first to falter. She turned toward me sharply, her voice low and urgent, asking what exactly I was doing. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I allowed the footage to continue, letting the timeline unfold naturally without interruption. Daniel stood halfway between the hallway and the living room, frozen in place as he watched scenes that he had never been shown before. I finally spoke only when the recording reached a point that confirmed what I had spent weeks assembling. I told the room calmly that I had not gathered this material to create conflict, but to present facts that had been hidden from view for years. The reaction was immediate, but not chaotic. It was quiet realization, the kind that spreads through a room before anyone fully knows how to respond. Vanessa stepped forward as if to interrupt, but the weight of what had already been revealed made her pause. For the first time since Richard's death, there was no performance left in the room, no carefully managed image to maintain, only the undeniable presence of truth finally exposed to the people who had lived inside its shadow without knowing it. And as I stood there watching every reaction unfold, I understood that nothing in this house would ever return to the way it had been before that moment. After the screen finally went dark, the silence that followed felt heavier than any reaction I had expected. No one spoke at first. It was not confusion anymore, and it was not denial. It was the slow realization that something foundational had been removed from the version of events they had all believed in. I stood near the edge of the living room, watching faces instead of the blank screen, because their reactions now mattered more than anything else. Vanessa was the first to move. She stepped forward quickly, her voice controlled but sharp, insisting that what everyone had seen was taken out of context, that private moments had been misrepresented. But her words no longer carried the same certainty they once did. Several relatives avoided her eyes. Others looked toward Daniel, waiting for him to respond, as if he now represented the final judgment of what was real. Daniel did not speak immediately. He looked at me first, then at the screen, then at Vanessa, as if trying to find a version of this situation that still made sense. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and uneven, asking whether I had known about this for a long time. I told him the truth. I told him I had only begun to understand after Richard's death, but that everything I had found had led me here with clarity rather than emotion. The word clarity seemed to land differently in the room than I expected. It was not dramatic, but it was final. One of the older relatives quietly asked to see the footage again. Another left the room without speaking, walking toward the hallway, as if needing air that did not feel controlled. Vanessa turned toward me again, this time no longer fully composed. She asked why I would do this in front of everyone, why I would choose to expose private matters in such a public way. I answered calmly that nothing about what had been shown was created in that moment, and nothing about it belonged only to one version of the truth. The recordings existed long before this night. The decisions had already been made long before I was ever given a role in them. Daniel stepped closer to me then, his expression conflicted, asking quietly whether Richard had ever explained any of this. I told him that Richard had not explained it to me, but he had lived inside it, and that silence had always been part of how it was maintained. For the first time, Daniel did not look away immediately. Instead, he stood still, absorbing what that meant. Vanessa tried once more to regain control of the situation, saying that emotions were clouding judgment, and that legal matters should not be influenced by interpretations of old material. But the room no longer responded to her tone. It had already shifted. Even those who had once supported her presence now spoke in quieter voices, questioning details, asking about timelines, trying to reconcile what they had just seen with what they had been told for years. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth was already doing what confrontation never could. As the evening continued, people began leaving one by one, not in anger but in silence. Conversations outside the house were brief, uncertain, as if no one wanted to define the moment too quickly. Vanessa remained near the fireplace long after most guests had gone, her posture still upright but no longer certain. Daniel eventually stood beside her, not as an ally, but as someone suspended between two versions of the same life. When the last guest finally left, I turned off the remaining lights and stood alone in the center of the living room. The house no longer felt like something that was being taken from me or returned to me. It felt like something that had finally revealed its true structure. And in that stillness I understood that what ended that night was not a family in the traditional sense, but an illusion that had lasted far longer than I ever realized.